is key to addressing major threats to biodiversity. So connectivity involves that structural connectivity, the physical relationship between patches of habitat, and the functional connectivity, which is the degree to which landscapes facilitate or impede the movement of organisms and processes. So sometimes, though they're used synonymously with connectivity, a corridor refers to a distinct component of the landscape that provides connectivity. And today, as you approach your SWAP revision, what approaches, challenges, and advice can help your SWAP include corridors? This series today, we've got three awesome speakers who are going to discuss several perspectives of connectivity and corridors on the landscape and highlight issues that you might consider in your plans. We'll introduce three of them in turn. The first is Zach Wurzelbach, who's with the Corridors and Crossings Program Director for the Center of Large Landscape Conservation. Next up is a friend of mine who I'm thrilled is here today, Jill Cohen, who's with the Science Coordinator with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of Science Apps and headquarters. And then we're going to have Rita Dixon, the State Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator from Idaho Department of Fish and Game. Some quick logistics. As you've seen, the meeting is going to be recorded. Mark and I are also going to take notes. During the breakout sessions afterwards, we have opportunities to do some follow-up internal discussion with everyone. And, we'd like to ask you if you could, if someone could take notes during those sessions, or at least the highlights, and let me know who, so that we can capture those for the written part of this. We can share with people who might not have been able to have attended. And after the breakout groups, we'll reconvene for about 5 minutes just to share what you all picked up as the top level messages. And then we'll adjourn. We'll be done by 3:30. Anyone have any questions before we dive in? Okay. Well, we'll be watching the chat, so please feel free to also put your questions in there as well, and we'll make sure we have some time for discussion with our speakers. So Zach, it's going to turn it over to you first to take it away.
Right. Let's see. Can everybody see my first slide here?
Yes.
All right, great. So yes, hi everybody. What I'm going to be talking about today is basically a little overview of our forthcoming report analysis we did. Basically what we did is we looked at all 50 state wildlife action plans. We read all their actions to basically identify good examples, to characterize the range of different connectivity actions that states are thinking of. And basically we wanted to pull out some good examples, highlight a range, and also kind of pull together some best practices and observations from what we've done. And before I go into it, I really should say, I think everybody knows this, but connectivity is having a pretty big moment right now. This map is basically from our state policy tracker, and we keep updating it, every couple months. What we're seeing are different types of legislation, is some that are focused specifically on funding for transportation. There's also laws in Vermont that are calling local planners to integrate connectivity into local and regional planning. Florida is got a really interesting one that's just providing a ton of money for land acquisitions and easements to advance connectivity. So we're seeing a lot of this stuff. And as I think you'll probably hear from Jill next, a lot of attention from the federal government as well, and a lot of funding opportunities there too. So as you're revising your plans again, it is a really great time to be looking at connectivity, to be planning for connectivity, particularly since as we're all waiting for RAWA to pass, there are a lot of other funding opportunities, and setting yourself up with good connectivity planning direction now, I think could be really helpful. So let's kind of get into what we did for our study. And when I say we, I mostly mean our junior interns and associates, read through every single action in all 50 swaps. They didn't do a word search. They didn't just look for connectivity. They read every single action. I know they did because we did it once, and then we shared a draft with some folks. They're like, hey, what about ours? And we're like, oh my God, we missed some. So we went back through and did it again. So we took a pretty wide look where, if it mentioned, dispersal, stopover sites, everything, aquatic, terrestrial, we got it in there. We also then really talked to a few folks like Rita and others from states that had really exemplary planning direction for connectivity. And again, we just zoomed in on actions. We're really just looking at what are states saying they're going to do to maintain, restore, advanced connectivity. So once we pulled out all the connectivity actions, then we coded them. And we thought a good way to do that would probably be by looking first at what type of action it is. And again, we're using the Salafsky conservation management measures protocol, which was recommended by AFWA for this plan revision. We also were just curious about, what general type of species folks were looking at. And then we also coded each of them by, if we could tell, what the threat was that action was addressing. So that was kind of how we broke everything down. We basically ended up creating a big spreadsheet with all the actions, and we basically have them coded. And once the report comes out, that is also something we'll be able to share. It's basically an enormous data set of different connectivity actions. So if you're looking and you're thinking about planning, I think it'll be just a pretty interesting resource. We did find, I think there's over 1,000. So there are quite a lot. And if we look, again, here's kind of how we were doing the coding. We look at each action and say, which one of the action categories does it fit into? And then we'd also look and said, which one of the threats is it addressing as far as we could tell. So just to give kind of a 30,000-foot view of what we were seeing, and again, this is from 2015, 2018, this is kind of how it broke out. The two biggest types of actions were really directed around land and water management, and then research and monitoring. And they're really high, the research and monitoring category. I mean, this included things like we need studies, we need to make a map, we need to collect data. Anything related to that was in this category. And I think what you see here too is the really high need for information on where connectivity is. The other big one was land and water management. And I should say a big reason this was a huge one is because there are over 1,000 actions. The vast majority were pretty vague and would just say things like maintain connectivity, etc. Nothing wrong with that, that's good. But I would say that, and I'll come back to this in discussion too, it is important to think about some of the other enabling factors that could also be actions to prepare yourself for doing that actual management on the ground, advanced connectivity. Looking broadly at species, again, a lot of times there wasn't a lot of specifics around a specific species, but you would have, basically direction around specific taxa. Fish were number one. Birds were another big one. And then you had a lot of regional variation, obviously, right? So out west, there was a lot more mammals. Out east, a lot more attention to herps. But if we're looking at a whole, nationwide scope, this is kind of the breakdown we saw. And then threats. This one I thought was really interesting. I think we were all thinking it was all going to be transportation. But the biggest category was, and perhaps unsurprisingly, natural systems modifications, but specifically dams and aquatic barriers. And that's because there's been a lot of decision support tools, starting back in 2005, evaluating barriers. And it's basically easier to map where you have barriers to connectivity in a constrained river system rather than across a terrestrial landscape. So that's a big one. After transportation, which is probably no surprise, we have residential and commercial and climate change. Now, one interesting thing, I think that is useful about this study is, we really were able to pull out a lot of these other aspects to connectivity and a lot of these other threats that maybe aren't getting enough attention right now, but I think that are really important to consider as you're doing planning. And so one, and this is again, is just on the left, we just kind of have some examples of some of the actions and how we've kind of coded them. So we can break them out, and I think you'd be able to do this yourself. When we pass around our spreadsheet, you could sort it basically by both the specific threat as well as different types of actions related to that threat. But in terms of urban development and urban expansion, particularly, we really saw two things. One is concern about exurban expansion into areas where there's species movement. But another really important thing to consider is basically maintaining and restoring connectivity within already developed areas. And in recent years, there has been a lot more attention to this, a lot more funding, a lot more research, particularly when you think about linking, connectivity in more urban areas and how their association with co-benefits for people, right? So thinking about maintaining, restoring parkways along riparian areas, et cetera. We saw some of that, and I think that's another kind of area to think about. Other thing too is there was a lot of direction. South Carolina had some good ones. They've got some good guidance for forest connectivity and things like that in urban context. But actions about the importance of having capacity to do outreach and communication with local planners so they can integrate connectivity into their local planning processes. And this is something that's been happening in Vermont. Vermont's law actually directed planners to consider connectivity when they're developing town plans. And we're just now starting to see some town plans that have integrated connectivity. There's an example right there. A lot of times, these things can involve voluntary measures too. So it's not necessarily always a regulatory tool. But I do think it is kind of a next trend we're starting to see in some places. And again, state wildlife planners and staff have a really important role in communicating where key areas are that should be considered by local planners. Another one that's huge and growing, as we know, with attention to renewables, in particularly is energy and mining. And I think this is another really important one to pay attention to that we didn't see as much attention to in the 2015 swaps, but should be getting a lot more in the Northeast, out West, pretty much everywhere. This is also an area where there's been a lot more research over the past 10 years on measures and standards for mitigating impacts. And IUCN just came out with a really massive compendium of best practices for mitigating impacts to avian species. The Nature Conservancy's got a great siting tool for wind. More of these things are coming online, and I think it's just going to be another really important one to consider. And again, even in a lot of the actions that we saw, a lot of them were really focused on understanding the threats that renewable energy development pay for species and their movements. Last one too, I'm just gonna like to highlight too is agriculture and aquaculture. New Jersey and Texas, I had not thought about aquaculture's impacts on connectivity, but lo and behold, we found a couple actions, particularly from New Jersey. I don't think I put them on here, but calling that out. And I wanted to highlight this one too because, for one, this is basically if you look at Florida's action, they basically implemented it. They passed a law to do it. So we do see that a lot, like where you have some of these actions and ideas that then get implemented and noticed by policymakers. But for agriculture in particular, I'm pointing this out because it's also been an emerging focus for USDA. And they're really, I think, in this next farm bill, there's a whole coalition that's going to be looking at opportunities for integrating connectivity and incentives for private landowners to conserve connectivity into a lot of the USDA's agricultural programs. So I think this is just another good one to look at. And I'm not going to go into all the different threats and actions. That take too long. You guys can read our report, but I do want to kind of highlight just some high-level thoughts and key findings we got from talking to planners who've done a really good job. And one, again, is being specific. And I think it's important to think, when I talk to our spatial ecologists who are really scientists, the question is always connectivity of what or for what and at which scale, right? And I think that is an important thing to address. And even if you're saying this part of the state is important for connectivity for this, we want to do something there, that is much better than just a general, we should maintain connectivity everywhere. And again, these are, and we keep seeing this and we keep hearing it, we hear it from, land trusts, swaps are blueprints, right? And so the more specific you can be about important places to maintain or conserve connectivity, the better. The other thing too is, some states have been looking at connectivity for over 15 years, Washington, et cetera. Other states are just getting started. So if you're developing actions for connectivity, think about where you personally are in the process. And there is kind of an order in operations, right? Like the first thing we always see is basic communication and coordination with other agencies, usually transportation. That's usually something that can kick it off. Or forestry, right? Forest action plans. Right now, connectivity is a key criteria for the Forest Legacy Program. That's something they're looking at, right? So those first conversations among different agencies is really important because connectivity is a cross-boundary issue. It's a cross-sector issue, right? So thinking about first have those conversations. So first action really should probably be, develop a partnership or steering committee with a transportation agency, et cetera. The other thing too, I think when you're looking, if you notice, we had all these land and water management actions, right? That's kind of the last step. You need to have funding in place to implement those things. You got to have, maps, you got to have done the outreach, et cetera, before you even get to that place on the ground. So for the next round, I do think it's really important to think about what are the enabling actions you need to then be able to do that on the ground work. And so thinking and being really thoughtful about that's important. Doing that too, again, think sectorally. And that's what really popped out with all these threats is specific threats are associated with specific threat sectors. So if your biggest threat in your state is renewable energy, maybe working with, the energy regulators, et cetera, other folks is kind of the first action you're going to take. Most important though, if you haven't made a connectivity map, that should be a really important one, right? States are mapping conservation opportunity areas, make some connectivity and conservation opportunities areas. Because land trust, everyone whose cooperation is required to connect and maintain it, they're going to be looking for a map. And best practices, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think New Jersey is a great example. They looked at what Washington State did and were like, hey, can we just use your guys' methods? Those look like they'll work. And they did. And once you have a map, put it online, allow people to access it, do some communication around it. That's really how you're going to reach folks. And that's what we've heard from a lot of people. Sometimes making a map can be politically controversial. So if you are making a new one, and this is something we heard from Vermont, do it collaboratively with land trusts because they will champion it. I think it's also a big lesson from CECAS, right? The big CECAS mapping thing is it's got collaborative buy-in, it's collaboratively developed, has collaborative buy-in. That makes it easier to put it out there. And then messaging that this is just voluntary. So in some cases, that's a really important thing. And I jump into communication, but that is a really, really important thing. And what we're hearing too, it's communication within your staff, communication with other agencies, communication with the public is just fundamentally important for both raising awareness of the connectivity, what you can do about it, et cetera. There's also some great process considerations. So one thing we heard from a lot of states that had really good actions was, they invested in collaborative processes or workshops at kind of landscape scales. New Jersey did 3 workshops, one in the South. Idaho did several. And what that does is allow you to get to those really specific actions that can probably be implemented because you're talking with stakeholders, right? So that's another really important way. So if you're able to bring in a map, talk with stakeholders about where you can do work, then you can start really getting to really important actions. And finally, like doing all this, the coordination, the mapping, et cetera, it really helps to have a staff person who can do that. I know more states are hiring SWAP coordinators. This is a role they could play, but having a designated coordinator, a designated point person, is particularly important for connectivity because it just requires so much coordination and collaboration with other entities to do. And if you can do that, I think it is an investment, particularly with some of the funding opportunities we're seeing, because you're going to be able to develop good proposals, et cetera. So that little investment, I think that's a case you can make too to leadership and politicals, like investment in position will allow us to leverage so much more funding through partners, matching funds, others, et cetera. Okay, how am I doing on time? Did I go too long? Am I just on time? I'm sorry, I lost track.
I think you're doing pretty good.
Okay. I think that's actually all I had. I will say though, just a quick thing is there is a lot of funding out there. And I think one thing we're really seeing the federal agencies doing with their funding is connectivity is becoming, one of the criteria for projects. We're hearing from DOI in particular. This is, they are really emphasizing it in their America the Beautiful Challenge grants. Partner for Fish and Wildlife has invested a lot of money in connectivity focused projects. Land and Water Conservation Fund grants are looking at this. As I mentioned, the Forest Legacy Program, Habitat Connectivity is one of their key criteria, key initiatives. And then we have some of the Wildlife Crossings pilot. So I do think too, if you're thinking about this now, if you're integrating connectivity considerations into your planning process and identifying actions, you should be able to set yourselves up pretty well. Great. And that's it. That's all I have.
Thanks, Zach. So if you have any questions, again, please put them into the meeting chat and we'll swing back after we hear from the other 2 speakers. Next up is Jill Cohen.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to present to you all today, and if you bear with me, I will try to figure out how to share my screen. Let's go for this one. Jason, can you let me know if I'm sharing the right version? Does it have the slide without the notes? Okay, great. Awesome. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Jill Cohen. I have the pleasure of working with Jason Goldberg for many years. So it's really great to have this invitation to spend time with you today. My goal is to just help educate you and spread the word on some guidance that came out instructing and advising federal agencies on how to prioritize corridors and connectivity in their decision making, their data and science, and their practices. So a brief note for those of you who aren't aware, CEQ, or the Council on Environmental Quality, it's an office that's underneath the Executive Office of the President, was created in 1969 as part of the National Environmental Policy Act. It covers a broad range of environmental issues. They advise the president, they also develop policy, and wildlife conservation is part of their portfolio. A lot of the work of CEQ centers around interagency coordination, as you'll see reflected in this guidance memo. So a few basics to start. This was developed through an interagency team that was assembled by CEQ, and it included representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as other Department of Interior bureaus. There was also staff from NOAA involved, Department of Transportation, et cetera. If you're interested, I could get you a more complete list. It was signed in March of 2023, and it debuted as part of a White House celebration called Conservation Day. So this was a marquee presidential level accomplishment that was celebrated earlier this year. It does have a reporting requirement that's coming up where agencies are directed to provide reports on their progress, which is, it was 180 days from the time it was signed. So that deadline is approaching in September of this year. It is a guidance document, so it does not itself create any new authorities or policies, but it does provide, and I'll go into more detail on this, a lot of incentives and guidance and ideas for how individual agencies and even bureaus within agencies can better incorporate corridors and connectivity into their work. And it is an element of both policies and practices, as I can detail here. First, with some definitions, we'll see how these align with the ones that Jason gave in his introduction, hopefully aligns. So they defines connectivity as the degree to which landscapes, waterscapes, and seascapes allow species to move freely and ecological processes to function unimpeded. And then within that, defines corridors as distinct components of a landscape, waterscape, or seascape that provide connectivity. It does describe both terrestrial, marine, freshwater, as well as airspaces as what federal agencies should consider when they're thinking about preserving and enhancing corridors and connectivity. So I wanted to flag that airspace, I think, was notable, got a lot of reactions and interest around the topic of airspaces being explicitly considered as part of the dialogue. So I want to just walk through briefly the kind of core elements of the guidance. So I wanted to highlight particularly for you all where there might be interested from the state and from the State Wildlife Action Plan perspective. So we'll quote here, the guidance is intended to provide clarity and consistency so that federal agencies can better coordinate with each other and with stakeholders and partners engaged in corridor and connectivity stewardship efforts. Throughout the guidance, it does refer specifically to states as some of those key stakeholders and partners. So apologies for all the words here, but I just wanted to synthesize some key points. So the first thing to draw your attention to is that the memo lays out really 3 different tactics, overarching tactics for how federal agencies can better incorporate corridors and connectivity. So the first is in their planning and their decision making. The second is through science and data. And then the third is through collaboration and coordination. So on the planning and decision making front, the guidance directs agencies to factor into their high-level planning and decision-making, as well as into their individual decisions, really with the goal of better planning and siting of federal projects, and really emphasizing the preference to have that incorporated early into planning processes. It also encourages agencies to explicitly consider corridors and connectivity in their funding, which we just heard in the prior presentation, we are seeing that with the America the Beautiful Challenge Fund already, with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, for example. So thinking about how we can more explicitly incorporate that into our funding decisions, and trying to also coordinate that funding across different programs, across different agencies. There are several elements related specifically to mitigation. I am not a mitigation expert, but it does call out mitigation specifically and encouraging explicit consideration of connectivity as it relates to mitigation decision-making. And it also talks about community engagement going from the level of local communities, but then all the way up to working at the landscape scale. There's a mention of science and data. And so not surprisingly, agencies are directed to use the best available science and data. It's worth noting that that does include Indigenous knowledge, which is in keeping with a lot of the priorities of this administration to really explicitly consider Indigenous knowledge and also describe what that is and how agencies can incorporate it into their decision-making. This particular guidance doesn't go too much into that, but it does specifically call out that Indigenous knowledge is part of best available science and data. And it encourages data sharing, making our data public and accessible, as well as encouraging federal agencies to incorporate data from outside sources and how to do that in our decision making. And then finally, this element around collaboration and coordination. The guidance directs agencies to support collaborations and partnerships, to also create different fora for collaboration and communication. But it says, create those when needed, but defer to existing when possible, which I think is interesting. And here's my little paraphrase, don't silo. So there's a lot of language in the memo, which is really just in the spirit of stop siloing, talk to each other, work together, work with others. So it's probably not surprising to you all the elements of this, but I think it is a powerful step forward to have it all laid out, to have guidance at the level of the White House, to have had an interagency team agree to this and put this together. So on my final slide, I just wanted to pose the question to you all, perhaps as fodder for discussion in the group, of how could improved federal coordination benefit you all in terms of your swaps. And so thinking about the connectivity being more explicitly factored into federal planning and decisions, having better data or better data transparency and data sharing, having these regional partnerships that federal agencies are supposed to be part of, that presumably states would also be engaging in, and just that improved overall consistency and coordination. I'm just curious how, in a better world, as we strive towards the goals outlined in this guidance, what might that mean for you all as states, and what requests or advice might you have for federal agencies so that we can better embody the goals of this memo? So that's all I have for my prepared remarks. I look forward to our discussion.
All right. Hey, thank you, Jill. Appreciate it. And then our third speaker for today is Rita. Rita, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. Is my video, you seeing me?
I see you. Don't see your presentation yet.
So let me share. Let's see. Share screen. Okay. Are you seeing my title slide?
Yes. Thanks,
okay,
Rita.
Great. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. And I was happy to see some of the attendees, friends I've worked with over the years. I saw Wendy Conley, Mark Howery, and some others. So great to have you on this call. So with Zach and Jill's presentations, what I'm going to present is just kind of a snapshot of what we've done in our most recent State Wildlife Action Plan revision. And when I had talked to Zach before, that was while we were just starting our latest revision, which is under review right now. So we have drawn from our past state wildlife action plans and various projects that have gone into our current plan. So, and with respect to corridors, and Zach showed a slide with the Conservation Measures Partnership Taxonomy of Threats. So we approach corridors, we had transportation corridors. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but also wildlife movement and migration considerations in swaps. Let's see, for some reason, this is not advancing. Oh, there it is. Okay, so I'd like to start by talking about corridors, and we've heard specific definitions, and there's a fact sheet in the works right now. It's in draft form from the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife agencies. And what they talk about is what we typically think of in terms of connectivity, and corridors are areas that promote wildlife connectivity in the scientific literature, media, policy by various terms, including corridors, connected habitats, stepping stones, pathways, linkages, landscape networks, among others. So the use of one term over another depends on the context, but the term corridors is becoming increasingly prevalent. And so for those of us on the call or the webinar today, I think we're all tending to think about it in the same context in terms of these discrete linear areas, but the term is now being used in some cases to be in the context of politically designated corridors. And so with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, we generally don't use the term corridors, and in its place, we tend to use the term routes and talk about movement and migration along particular routes instead of corridors to avoid any political context that some may interpret it as. So I'd like to start by backing up a little bit. Before our latest revision, we had a State Wildlife Action Plan Enhancement Fund grant titled Modeling Connectivity and Enhancing the Usability, Accessibility of Idaho State Wildlife Action Plan. And so these are just a couple of figures out of our report. But basically what we were trying to look at was various connectivity. The figure on the left is looking at greater sage-grouse connectivity using a regional connectivity map and habitat use. And so the point here is that, connectivity in itself, when we're thinking about it in a statewide context, can be really variable based on where you are. So animal movement in one part of the state, for example, may be different than another part of the state. And this figure captures that in terms of the upper figure is in the West Owyhee sage-grouse conservation area in the southwest part of the state. And then this other one is the desert conservation area. So animals can move in different ways depending on what's going on there. And then the other thing we were trying to do in that is look at the distribution of species observations used in connectivity analyses, using telemetry locations that were used in movement pathways. Some of these red points represent general observations or telemetry locations. that were collected at inconsistent intervals and not selected for movement data sets. So data going into various connectivity exercises are also variable. So Zach touched on this in his presentation in terms of the conservation measures partnership, both what they refer to as taxonomy of threats, and then Zach also included the action category. So in our latest State Wildlife Action Plan revision, our agency opted to, instead of referring to these as threats, we've chosen the term challenge instead of threat. And so this list includes the same ones from CMP, and we organized our State Wildlife Action Plan based on these. And as Zach pointed out in his presentation, and one of his graphics, is that, if you think about connectivity and movement and migration, that is affected by a lot of different things. And so throughout our State Wildlife Action Plan, depending on these categories, we include actions that address connectivity in many of these, in particular, natural systems modifications, as well as energy production and mining, transportation and service corridors, and the biological resource use here. This includes like forest harvest, timber harvest. So I've just listed these to give you an example of what categories are in our State Wildlife Action Plan, and many of them address connectivity. So the other thing we've done, and this is the broad category, challenge category of transportation service corridors. Here's a pronghorn seasonal migration route for the Upper Snake River Plain in Idaho. Pronghorn is a species that's very much affected by transportation infrastructure. And one of the things that we tried to do was start by looking at overarching effects of these various challenges. So I've just listed some here. So for example, one of the effects of transportation and service corridors is that it hinders big game movements and migration, principally highways and fencing. But it can also affect fish movements through culverts or other types of infrastructure. It can cause direct mortality, and then also can result in habitat conversion, fragmentation, and reduced quality. For example, invasive species introduction or increased wildfire ignitions. So next, I'm just going to touch on some examples to give you a sense of how we have addressed this. So for each of these challenge categories, we include voluntary actions that are intended to benefit species of greatest conservation need and responsible transportation service corridors by addressing the effects of stressors if it's occurring. So in this particular example, this is a moose using a newly developed passage opportunity under Idaho State Highway 28. And so what we've tried to do is look at what is the effect of these problems on wildlife, and based on the effect, what can we do to address that problem? So for example, abundance and distribution can be reduced by disturbance or displacement, movement or migration barriers, fence collisions or entanglement, wildlife vehicle collisions, habitat loss or degradation from transportation and utility infrastructure operations or maintenance. So one of our actions in our latest revision of the State Wildlife Action Plan to address this problem is we need to reconnect seasonal ranges where transportation systems have interrupted migration routes. So for example, by building crossing structures, wildlife-friendly fencing, and conservation easements as appropriate to increase the connectivity for wildlife movement. Another example, so the last one, you know, generally talking about terrestrial, but we also need to deal with connectivity in aquatic habitats. So this is just an example from our aquatic side. And these are actions that are intended to benefit species of greatest conservation need and sustainable water management if the stressors are affecting the quantity, quality, or connectivity of aquatic habitat. So an example of the effect is fish movements and survival are reduced by passage barriers from water management infrastructure or operations. And I know that Zach pointed out the natural systems modification in his presentation. An example action is to facilitate fish species of greatest conservation need passage and benefit water management. For example, irrigation, diversion upgrades, fish passage structures, fish diversion screening, supplemental stream flow, and others. And one thing I will note is that in Idaho and in the Northwest, for example, there are fish passage structures for anadromous fish, salmon, steelhead at some of the dams. But one of the problems we've had over the years is getting appropriate passage structures for the Pacific lamprey, which is a very different organism, moves differently. And so the fish passage structures, one size does not fit all. So that's another thing we have to consider in terms of addressing connectivity and getting lamprey where they need to go. So I also wanted to highlight something that we included in this particular revision of our State Wildlife Action Plan. We included a section to highlight conservation success stories for certain species. And I chose the Northern Rocky Mountain fisher in the context of our conversation today, because one of the big issues for fisher in the past has been in forest systems, especially corporate timberlands, you know, fisher movement in these areas that have these large clear cuts, and what do we need to do to keep fisher connected? And so we had a multi-year, multi-organization effort to better understand the habitat needs of fishers in north central Idaho. And we worked with the forest industry in our last revision. And that was one of the things they said they really needed to know and understand to be able to manage better for this species. And so we used DNA hair snaring, satellite radio collars to collect occurrence and movement data to get a better understanding of how these animals use the landscape. And that effort provided really valuable information about fishers and their habitat and distribution and movements that contributed to the Fish and Wildlife Service deciding that an ESA listing was not needed. And it helped forest managers better understand fishers' needs and take that into consideration when planning forest management projects. So Jill touched on this, and I was really happy to see that the mention of airspace is explicitly considered. So I wanted to bring this up too, thinking about the aerosphere, airspace, whatever we want to call it. And, you know, we have animals that are volant and they're moving through the airspace for various things, from foraging, but also for dispersal, migration, and behavioral interactions in some cases, especially birds and bats, but also insects, monarch butterflies. And so we need to be thinking about, you know, connectivity in the aerosphere or airspaces as well, because if we disrupt that, then we're going to create problems. And an example of that is if we think about wildlife that migrates through the air, birds and bats, and we have wind energy facilities on the landscape. If an animal, you know, if a particular species has a migration that's dispersed across the landscape, it's not, there are going to be areas where they're fine, but it's more of a problem if they have specific migration routes that channel them through down through some area and right out onto where we have a big wind energy facility. And so we need to think about it not only in the context of direct mortality from turbine strikes or from the footprint, which is how we often think of it, but it can also disrupt movement for certain species. And then finally, I just include a link to our latest revision of our State Wildlife Action Plan. And as I mentioned, it's currently under review with the regional review team. And I'm happy if any of you have any questions about our work, feel free to contact me. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. Well, we do have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has any, you can either raise your hand or put a note in the chat. I saw that there have been a couple of questions that we've already answered. And Drew, I see your note about, are you referring to the CEQ guidance?
Yeah, yep. Indigenous knowledge document there.
It might be my quote. Let me try one more time. I'll try to just put the link itself.
Okay, thanks.
That'll be better. Yeah, of course.
Any other questions? Zach, I do have a quick one for you. Do you have an anticipated time when you think the report will be done?
First week of August.
Okay. Oh. Okay. Give it one more moment. Otherwise, we'll take some time and we'll move into the breakouts. All right, well, not hearing any, what we'll do is, we want to take some time now to go into the breakout rooms. And we've got a couple of questions which Mark just put in. So, oh, actually, wait, let me see, there was one more. Okay, that's the updated link. Hang on a second. Okay, and that link works. Thanks, Jill. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to divide out into breakout rooms, and the questions, which I just lost, here we go, is how are you approaching wildlife corridors in your SWAP? And what tools, resources, and help do you need to address wildlife corridors as you develop your SWAP? And then, on top of that, I think Joe's raised a good question too, following up on what she mentioned from the CEQ guidance. Where are you seeing those potential links based on what you just heard with the federal side, as well as you develop those? So, Mark, we've got 19 people here. Are you ready to send us all off?
I am.
How many are you going to do? Oh, we're actually losing people. We're
Yeah,
at
I've got
17.
4 rooms right now. But let's just see how it goes. But if we could have somebody just kind of volunteer to have capture some thoughts that we can share with the rest of the group, that would be awesome.
Yeah, and just a note, we do have half an hour planned for this, but Mark and I'll keep an eye on the rooms and we can reconvene sooner if it's appropriate.
Okay. I'm gonna open the rooms.
I guess we're the first 3 back. That's funny.
Is Chris Marsh still with your agency, Wendy? Do you know him? He's one of our GIS, a former GIS person. He went to your agency,
No.
but I haven't really kept track of him, whether.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't
Okay, I'm sure you have a big agency, so.
I'll look him up though. I'll tell him Eileen said hi.
You do, if he's still there.
Okay. That's
All
good.
right.
Speaking of highs, hi Eileen and Wendy.
Hey,
Hi.
Rita.
Nice to see you.
So nice to see the 2 of you.
And there's
Thank you.
Mark Howry. A few of the old gang are still hanging out,
Yeah, the
hanging
old
on.
gang, that's right.
Mark.
And Mark, who was, Nebraska.
Wow.
Before he
Super
moved to the
cool.
big city.
It's
All
great
right.
to see everybody.
We just
All right.
couldn't stay away.
All right, folks. First, I'm going to give Wendy points for having the best background today.
Oh, those cute little burrowing owls.
I like being part of the game. Yeah.
Well, I'll
I
try-
didn't realize that you're positioned right there in that gap between the burrowing owls. That's very
I know,
wide.
that's perfect. That's really great.
All right. Well, thought we would take just a couple of moments to close out. So I was in breakout group number 1. I don't know if one of those folks want to give a report out, or I can highlight just some of the main points that we talked about.
Right ahead, Jason.
All right. Yeah, now they're all shy, but during the group, it was pretty active. I think the 2 things that really came up out of the discussion was one out of Dylan from Georgia noted that, they're working on trying to define what the routes are and how fuzzy do you make them. And that has certain implications for doing certain things. And so Zach said he was going to refer us over to certain data sets that can help you look at different species and, looking at what how you define your defined your barrier, not your barriers, how defined your corridors are can influence your decisions. So that was an interesting point. And then Jeff, Virginia is ahead of the curve. They've already developed their corridors plan. And so they know where their major impediments are. And it was interesting to hear that birds are the focus species for a lot of their major corridors. Therefore, they're looking at the aerial side of things, even though wind farms aren't really the barrier that they are in some other states. So I thought that was novel. Am I missing something from that group that you want to report out on? Okay. Someone from breakout group number 2 want to give some of your highlights?
I think that was us, right, Kim? Yeah. Kim or Kathy? JM, do you want to report or should I hit highlights?
I thought you were taking notes, Mark.
Okay. Well, it was great discussion. I learned about the Change program, connecting habitats across New Jersey, I think, right? Which is a standalone program that's working to connect wildlife and remove, or overcome barriers to migration and movement. And it's separate than the statewide action plan, but the Kim and Kathy are working to integrate that into their SWAP and eventually maybe have an interactive map that's part of the SWAP that can kind of identify the those corridors and hopefully the SWAP can identify actions to overcome some of those barriers. So it's really cool that New Jersey has that. I just thought it was interesting that there's also some effort, maybe not completely off the ground yet, for the public to be able to report where there's roadkills that can help maybe direct where reconnecting corridors or connecting corridors might be prioritized. And the Change program is not only a mapping system, but also provides some guidance to states and can help map some of those trouble spots. JM from South Dakota talked a little bit about, I think it was used, mentioned a little bit about the, you do have some work happening on big game, maybe not necessarily coordinated or connected yet to SWAP. And asked if, we could maybe come up with a resource, identifying those states that have incorporated corridors in their state wildlife action plan. And I don't know if Zach is still with us, but I think that's one of the products that'll come out of the report is, maybe direct states to those, if they haven't quite, incorporated corridors yet in their SWAP, go to the report that Zach and the Center for Landscape Conservation created to help with that. Is that correct, Zach?
Yeah, I think we can have basically a list of states that have done it by 2015, but then also ones like New Jersey, Oregon's got some great work that's coming out. Just a list of all the ongoing efforts of mapping corridors, et cetera, as well. So we should be able to pop that in there, no problem.
Yeah, so that'll be a great resource, Zach. Okay, I'll end there.
How about breakout group number 3?
Who
wants
to talk about it or wants to share?
Well, unless Liz jumps in, I'll just try to give Liz knows the technical details way more than I do, but I'm from Georgia and we're just getting started with it. We're looking at, connecting our conservation lands through high quality habitat based on land cover, and also areas that support high diversity of SGCN. That's the general approach we're looking at. It's mostly based on known species occurrence data, although we had a nice discussion about the Maxent models that SARP is working on developing for a lot of aquatic species throughout the Southeast. That may not be in time for us, but that is an approach to consider. And then also we are going to be looking at we're looking at the Southeast Blueprint from CCAS. They're super helpful and how we capture some of the regional, we want to capture some of those regional conservation priorities areas that have already been, identified, but we're going to put our own spin on it with updated species occurrence data and our existing conservation land. So Liz talked about differences between, having really fine scale functional information on corridors like actual movement routes for species, but that we have a lot of information gaps there for a lot of our SGCN, so that won't be sufficient to scale this up to a large scale corridor project. So Liz, what am I missing?
You said it better than I could have.
About that.
Thank you, Brett, for jumping in. This was kind of like a game of chicken as to who's holding out last before they speak. Now, you covered everything great, Brett.
Thanks.
All right. And then we got the last group, last but not least.
I can start and then I'll ask Julie or Wendy to pick up what I missed. Julie and I were talking about working in the Midwest. It is not such a dramatic system for identifying big game movements and really great, large landscape scale migration movements. And so we were just kind of discussing how we might start incorporating it, and we were kind of at a loss. So I think we're both in the learning phase of trying to see what's worked elsewhere. And then Wendy joined us and gave us lots of examples of how to think about it strategically, how to link into other people's priorities, and offering the Washington approach as a way that we can perhaps plug in our information. They happen to have a landscape conservation coordinator. And it sounds like some very active land trusts. But also, I mean, something I picked up on, just because we are in our agency so focused on landowner habitat work. A point that Wendy made, are there some natural corridors on ag lands that could be protected as incentives? So that's not no priority in our private lands program. So I think that's a really interesting idea to take to our private lands folks. And one of the changes we're making in South Dakota is that we're trying to better involve our GIS staff, and that's why JM was able to participate today. And he and the rest of our habitat staff are going to be key to, I think, linking us to some of these more sophisticated planning tools that GIS folks use, but we don't necessarily use in the wildlife field. And the other point Wendy brought up is start with the systems. Don't necessarily start with individual species and work up to corridors. Think about what are the big barriers that are prohibiting your systems from functioning. So I'll ask Julie or Wendy to chime in.
Sounds about right. Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah, I think in Minnesota, we haven't quite reached the point of thinking about corridors and connectivity yet in our revision process, but this was good to kind of give an idea of what we should be focusing on. And I think compared to the last time, we want to be a lot more specific with our actions or goals instead of kind of just using connectivity or corridors as a buzzword that's kind of just thrown in there. And we'll probably improve on some GIS layers we made the last time that kind of resembled connectivity, but weren't strictly focused on corridors and things. So also trying to use GIS more to have more useful products.
Sounds good. All right, well, with that, we're at 3:33. I want to thank everyone again for taking the time. Mark, do you have any closing comments for us?
Yeah, if any of our group reporters could shoot Jason or I the notes, and we'll capture those from the discussion, that'll be helpful. But great, I know, speak for my great group with Kim, Kathy, and JM, great conversation in the breakout group, and really big thank you to Zach and Rita and Jill for their presentations. I think this is a great session.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's good to see everybody.
Bye.